I'm Douglas Mason, CEO of Naturally Splendid, symbol NSP on the TSX Venture Exchange. Naturally Splendid is a biotechnology and consumer products company focused on the global cannabis and health markets. Naturally Splendid is expanding distribution in this rapidly growing market with products currently in Canada, the USA, South Korea, Germany, and Australia. To view our comprehensive company presentation and for more information, please visit our website at naturallysplendid.com.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Stewart Muir, Executive Director of the ResourceWorks Society. Welcome back to the show, Stewart.
Thank you, Jim.
Stewart, it was 5 years ago the Mount Polley mining tailing pond broke out of its containing dam and spilt out. People are calling it one of the worst environmental disasters in BC history. Was it?
It was unplanned. It was a shock. I remember where I was on BC Day 5 years ago in 2014 when that happened. And when those images first started coming, people couldn't believe it. It was out of the blue, and the impact was felt in the mining world around the world, because when something like this happens, it's of great interest to engineers and the geotechnical people who are responsible for making sure a tailings pond is safe, because we need to have these minerals. Copper, which they mine from Mount Polley, is used in almost everything in our lives. It's needed for electric vehicles, electric buses. You can't have those things without copper. You can't get copper without mining it, and you can't mine for copper without doing it safely. And of course, it's horrifying when something like this happens. No lives were lost, but it did cause ripples throughout the mining professions, and I think that's still being dealt with today. But recently, we went to a scientist to ask the question: what is the impact 5 years after the spill happened? We found Dr. Lynn Anglin. That's the founder of Geoscience BC, which is a distinguished research group that looks at all manner of geological, geoscience-related issues and makes advice to industry, to government, and they do some very good work. So she has actually also been the chief scientist on the Mount Polley tailings pond spill cleanup and reclamation, and retired from that, so she's now free to speak as a private citizen. She wrote an article. We posted it at resourceworks.com. It's called How Things Were Made Right After the Mount Polley Spill.
And how were things made right?
Well, it covered quite a bit of land. One of the things they found is that it was going to cost a lot of money. Ultimately, the company, rather than walk away from the spill, they spent $70 million. That's how much went into the environmental impact studies, the remediation work, the monitoring of the areas impacted by the spill. It's an enormous amount of money that has resulted in a lot of work to bring things back. And they looked at a couple of creek channels. They looked at Quesnel Lake. They developed some new trout spawning and rearing habitat. They put it into one of the creeks. They've allowed rainbow trout to come back now into the rebuilt parts of the creek. And they believe that they've got some healthy fish habitat now. It's an effort that has involved the local First Nations. So they've got a lot of workers out there who've been part of this. They were continuing to release hatchery-raised trout. In terms of the creek corridor, they've removed most of the tailings from that. They've returned them to the tailings facility. They brought in native soil and lots of organic material. Jim, one of the innovative things they've done in order to reestablish the land is they've taken the tree stumps that were affected by the spill, and they've taken some of those, they've turned them upside down, and then they've kind of planted them to be nurseries for new vegetation. So initially, when people were walking around this, they saw all these upturned stumps and, all those roots up in the air. It looks kind of unsightly. Some people formed the impression that things had been left off worse, but actually that was a rebuilding strategy to ensure the nutrients in the soil and the roots and the root systems there that were no longer, part of a living tree were going to be part of the renewal. That's starting to happen. It's starting to green up now, and it's a dramatic difference. They've planted something like 500,000 native plants, shrubs, and trees. They've got seedlings that they actually took from trees on the site, raised them into trees in local nurseries, and then replanted them. So they're not bringing in some non-native species. So it's very localized. They are using some of those trees to establish perching and roosting platforms for birds. So they're bringing that bird life in really quickly. They're already seeing signs of success. They've got hawks, cranes, swans, grouse, even lynx have been spotted there since the regeneration. So, in short, I think they have applied the best knowledge possible. They've got people who really know what they're doing. I know there have been some groups that have been saying, "Oh, nothing that can be done is enough. This is terrible. The damage is not what they say." Well, the evidence is that the lake has been restored to health. You've actually got fishing derbies every August for the last several years on Quesnel Lake looking for fish. The anglers are happy to take part in those, so we know that's working well. And, overall, they're not saying that it's 100% done, but they do believe they've not walked away from the problem. They put their heart and soul into it. Bear in mind that there's something like 350 jobs at stake here when this mine is up and running fully. These are good union jobs that create an enormous amount of stability for surrounding communities and First Nations too. So we have to consider society, industry, the needs of government when we consider all these things and make sure it gets done right for the environment. That looks like what's happening with Mount Polley. So I think people who want to be aware of the facts should check out Dr. Angled's article. Again, it's at resourceworks.com.
Now, of course, there are some people who are saying charges should have been laid after this incident. Has the company done enough to mitigate whatever damage was done?
Well, that's a call that the federal authorities make. They still have the right to do that. And I think the lock 'em up thing is more of a, probably a fundraising tactic to try to get some people excited about it. And when you look at the actual facts of the matter, it's ultimately a decision of highly qualified professionals as to whether there are legislative violations that require whatever kind of follow-up. Those people are doing their jobs. In the meantime, we've had the professionals doing their work. All the evidence we have in terms of scientific evidence, if we're going to go by science, I suggest we should, is that this is going in the right direction and that we can be pretty safe and secure in knowing that the right thing has been done. And above all, let's make sure it doesn't happen again, because tailings ponds will be with us for a long time to come. Our reliance on minerals and metals in our lives is not going away. If anything, it's getting greater. We need to mine, whether it's lithium, copper, gold, a whole host of mineral elements that go into your phone. There's probably, I've heard, somewhere between 35 and 60 different elements that have to be mined in order for us to be able to walk around with a smartphone. They're incredibly reliant on responsibly obtained elements, and that comes from mining. So we need the stuff. We've got to get the stuff safely. Let's keep moving forward.
Have the lessons from Mount Polley led to safer mining?
Oh, this stuff, when it happens in a place like BC that prides itself on having strong legislation, where we've got mining practices, mining professions, we've got education at the universities in the highest standards anywhere in the world. You won't find higher. When something like this happens, it's absolutely heart-wrenching for those professionals, because no one wants this to happen. Elaborate measures and surveillance occurs. Something obviously went terribly wrong, and there's a professional need to figure it out, address it, and make sure these conditions cannot be knowingly replicated again in future. I mean, that's the best you can do. That's how we handle any other kind of issue, whether it's aviation safety or medical safety in society. That's what professionals do.
We'll have more with Stewart Muir right after this.
Cypress Development Corp. is developing a world-class lithium resource in the heart of Clayton Valley, Nevada. The size of the resource makes the Clayton Valley project a premier asset with the potential to impact the future of lithium supply. Cypress Development Corp. trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol CYP, the OTCQB, symbol CYDVF, and on Frankfurt, symbol C1Z1. For more information, please visit our website, cypressdevelopmentcorp.com.
Avon Resources Limited is a gold exploration company with significant projects in British Columbia and the Yukon. Trading on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ABN, and the OTCQB, symbol ABNAF. Surrounded by world-class gold deposits and mines, Avon's 23,000 hectares Forest Kerr Gold Project is located in the heart of the Golden Triangle in northwestern BC. For more information, visit us at avonresources.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Stewart Muir. Stewart, there's a report about executives thinking about the risks of energy. Can you tell us about it?
Well, recently we saw 3 companies from the oil sands, the Canadian oil sands, decide that they're so frustrated with some of the operating conditions they face that 3 CEOs of those companies took out a full-page ad. It went into 30 newspapers across the country. Now, when I see that kind of thing, and you know, we're former, we're news guys, Jim. We know that when people want to reach a large audience, they have different ways they can do it. These CEOs clearly wanted to reach a lot of Canadians, and they are very concerned about the operating conditions that oil sands face. They aired a number of these issues. The 3 companies that did it, Canadian Natural Resources Limited, Cenovus, and Meg Energy, these represent combined market capitalization of probably $55 billion on last week's valuations. And you think, well, how big is that? Relatively speaking, you take the S&P TSX renewables index, the whole index of renewables companies that is tracked by the Standard & Poor index, it is worth about 2/3 of that. All the companies. And the scale of oil sands investments isn't just big locally, it's been very large globally as well. And unfortunately, one of the things that's happened in the past several years is that a number of the global companies that invested in developing Canadian energy have, for a variety of reasons, left the country. They've sold off their assets. And a couple of the companies whose CEOs have been out talking to Canadians are among those who bought these assets from the departing majors. And I think ultimately that will be good for the Canadian economy and Canadian investors, but right now they're not feeling a lot of love. And, you know, I just think that it was a pretty bold move. We're coming up to a federal election. If you're a corporation in Canada, you've got to be careful about how you expose yourself to the winds of politics. There are certain things, not just because it's good common sense, but also we're moving into an election where there's the Elections Act, and you have to follow certain rules very carefully. And no doubt they did that with this ad. You know, I think what they're trying to convey, and I say this having been exposed to management decision making for decades in Canada, and I follow a lot of these companies and large Canadian companies very closely. So I do think I have a fairly well informed perspective on thinking in the C-suite that chief executives occupy. I think they know, first of all, these CEOs, that oil is the elixir of economic life in Canada. And they know that the finance minister, maybe not all of the cabinet ministers in Ottawa, but the finance minister certainly knows that. And because if we didn't have oil exports in our economy, we would be, I've said, just another Argentina. Now that might be, I didn't carefully calibrate that exact number, but the impact of those exports would, if we removed them, would bring us down several runs in terms of our economic strength as a country. And what we see in politics right now is a lot of elected politicians are just feeding back to interest groups and others they hear from what they want to hear about trade. I call them trade skeptics, and also about energy. I say that some of the voices out there on energy you might describe as energy fantasists, because the things they're asking for cannot be verified in any sort of thought process based on known technology. We have seen, I think, a sense in the Canadian energy industry that the federal government is hesitant to be as supportive of these trade-based activities as they need to be if they want to continue to get the benefits. And clearly, they do want to get those benefits. There's a couple of recent laws that were passed, one of them to ban oil tankers off the northwest coast of BC. That was a very upsetting occurrence for a lot of First Nations that actually do want to be engaged in the productive economy, who wanted there to be potential opportunities. That's now been removed by the current government. Another one, Bill C-69, which a lot of Albertans are calling the No More Pipelines Act, was hoped it would be mitigated by some recommendations that came out of industry experts, which for the most part, the government, we're just going to ignore that because we know best. And a lot of people have looked at this, different think tanks and groups, some competing politicians who you can, be skeptical about if you wish, but a lot of experts have looked at it and said, this is not well thought through. It's going to be quite harmful. So that's another thing these CEOs are probably thinking about. They're also thinking about the fact that in Ottawa today, there's a lot of excitement about renewable energy, and who isn't excited about that? The boring reality in the Canadian economy is that traditional energy still drives the bus in terms of fuel use as well as the economy. And I think the emerging piece of knowledge, and it's not an emerging truth because this has been around for a long time, but the widespread understanding of innovation in the oil and gas economy is probably the most important thing, because if you look at the fact that more than 70%, probably 75%, I've heard as high as 85%, depending on how you measure it, of the energy we use in our lives every day comes from oil and gas and coal. And yet, it's so easy to find energy zealots who will tell you, no, it's no problem. We just need to make up our minds, make a wish, and we will change that overnight. But it's impossible to find someone who actually knows what they're talking about, who understands the technology, who can show you how you could do that. So I think when we see out of the Canadian oil sands, we have a 30% reduction in emissions just in one decade, because these engineers, they're always out there, turning the knobs and tightening up the seals and doing 100 different things, because they're motivated to make their operations more profitable, and also they are regulated that they have to make them more sustainable, more energy efficient, and overall greener. So you've got this trend happening, which I think a lot of people who are kind of emotionally tied to the idea that we have to have certain alternatives, otherwise they're not going to ever be happy, are looking at. And I think if we had, federally speaking, if the CEOs were heard, we would have more acknowledgement that by working with the things that already provide reliable energy, making them much, much better, because heaven knows they're not perfect now, far from it, we could make most of the gains that we need to make through energy efficiency as well in automobiles. That's another big emerging area, but it's one that a lot of politicians don't like to acknowledge or talk about, the fact that the traditional engines can be made so much more efficient, and we see some radical new designs coming along that have the benefit of working and existing within a supply chain of fuels that already exists and doesn't need to be built from scratch.
We'll have more with Stewart Muir right after this.
Grand Portage Resources' Herbert Gold Project in southeast Alaska highlights increased gold resource, indicated and inferred, of 860,000 ounces, in excess of 10 grams per ton gold. Expansion drilling is planned on the Herbert Gold property for the summer of 2019. Grand Portage Resources trading symbols are GPG on the TSX Venture, GPTRF on the OTCQB, and GPB on Frankfurt. For more information, please visit our website, grandportage.com.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Stewart Muir. The federal government recently just declared a national emergency over climate change. If there's an emergency, I didn't hear any sirens go off or anything. What does it mean?
Yeah, I think we're seeing this that provincial governments are being asked to declare climate emergencies. The federal government has been asked, and they passed I think it was a motion in Parliament. Municipalities are being asked to declare climate emergencies. What's going on there is that the people advocating for emergencies are going to come in next to say, look, you've declared an emergency, so now you're bound by law to do these other things that we want you to do. So it's kind of a cute way for people with an agenda to try to put the processes in place that will force the lawmakers, decision makers to adopt their full agenda. And that's why I think we should be just a little bit careful when we examine the idea of a climate emergency. I would say, because we have a pressing issue with climate, that we should be looking at things that are achievable. And if we want to escalate to an emergency, it should be an emergency where we do things that make a real difference. Because right now, a lot of the propositions are more about social change, about social engineering. People want to go to cities and compel them to build bicycle lanes so everyone's riding a bicycle. Well, we have a graying population. People aren't going to be riding bicycles to go down to see their gerontologist over the next decade. Maybe some will. Let's hope so. Let's hope there's some spry 80-year-olds zipping around on their bikes. I've seen it in Oak Bay where I live. It definitely happens. But it's not, a fit for everybody. I think in order to focus on what can be done, first of all, thinking globally, not just locally. That's one of the problems we have right now. We need to face the fact that the climate problem is global, and we need world-scale thinking to succeed. And I see, for example, there are some who are opposing sending Canadian LNG to Asia. So we've just recently seen the approval of LNG Canada late last year. That's a $40 billion project. It will allow lots of countries in Asia that are also supporting the investment in this project to secure the fuels they want for their cleaner future. Now, what we should do, especially people who believe there's a climate emergency, is we should double or triple or quadruple LNG exports from Canada as quickly as possible. So we need to fast track these additional projects on both the west and the east coasts. There may be more localized emissions that come from this. There certainly will be, actually. But these will be easily and quickly offset by gains elsewhere. Another thing we need to do is focus on the demand side, people who use fuels, not the supply side. There's been this multi-million-dollar effort to demonize Canadian energy, oil and gas in particular, and cast it as being somehow not a desirable source of energy. Actually, that's completely unfounded. Canadian energy is as good as American energy. Let's not get into that underdog mentality. We need to get out of that, and we need to face the fact that emissions are actually caused by consumers, consumption. When you combust the gasoline in your cars, when you release the emissions, not when it is manufactured or mined, drilled. And so you take a place like China, they can get crude oil from Canada to make liquid fuels. They will continue to do that if they can, or they will resort to other sources of fuel. They'll convert maybe coal to liquids with massively greater climate impacts. That's happening. We can be part of an alternative to that. Another thing we need to do, if we think there's an emergency, but we should do it anyways, is recognize that Canadian products are not the only ones that carry climate implications. Now, last year, Canada imported, I think it was about $19 billion worth of crude oil, just crude oil, from foreign countries. But we didn't apply our carbon tax to those crude oil imports. We didn't apply our environmental standards, our social standards, none of those things. We just simply say, yeah, we'll take that oil. We're not going to ask any questions about how it was produced or what its impacts are. We just want to get your oil. Well, we don't approach Canadian oil and gas that way. We are incredibly scrupulous. So the current approach to those crude oil imports is wrong-headed, and we need to reverse it. We need to eliminate those imports, replace them with responsibly produced Canadian oil and gas. Another thing we need to do as a small trading-based economy is stand up for ourselves better in the competitive world. You know, we need to see the encouragement of private philanthropy efforts in Canada, just like those in the States, where they're great at spending money on these noble social environmental causes. But in Canada, we kind of let others outside our country do most of that. So if we had tax credits for Indigenous people, especially those who believe that self-destiny can be created through standing on one's own 2 feet. And most First Nations I encounter want to have economic development on their lands in order to create the future for themselves and their children that they desire. We could empower those groups to be part of getting out the information about the Canadian economy that is not getting out right now to a lot of people. Another thing we need to do is innovate relentlessly, especially in things that are already working. You know, for example, we've seen quite a bit of noise about Ottawa giving what are often termed subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. I've looked into this issue. I thought it was interesting what's going on there. Well, you talk to the Ministry of Finance, they'll say we've already gotten rid of the subsidies. They're not in the system anymore. So if you hear someone claiming that, they're not up to date on their information. You need to encourage innovation in lowering the greenhouse gas footprint through what we do in upstream production. You know, if you look at, say, the newest oil sands mine in Canada, that's Fort Hills, they're about on par with the average refined barrel of oil from the United States in terms of its emissions. So we can be pretty happy with that. One of the things we also see is that, and again, I'm thinking to the CEOs who are wondering why is it the world doesn't understand things as rationally as we do. I mean, that's how they think about it. You can agree or disagree. Whether they always get it right, their shareholders ultimately decide. But I think the loss of economic analysis in decision making is happening at all levels of government. We see a more whimsical approach to a lot of the decisions. A lot of emotional decisions are being made without any sort of economic study. I could think of a lot of cases there where this happens. I mean, in Vancouver, the city went ahead with a ban on natural gas without any economic consultation or studies. They didn't look at the cost of alternatives or indeed the availability of improved equipment that people can adopt. So we see that quite commonly. Now, one of the other big things is if we want to do a rapid transition of our energy dependency, the single biggest thing we can do is move to much more nuclear power. It's our best zero carbon solution after abundant hydro. It's, I would argue, better than continuing to improve the oil sands and natural gas, which we should continue doing because we're going to need them for a long time. But nuclear is that big step. We have the uranium. We have the long history of mining it safely and beneficially. And we have the technology, made in Canada technology, that lets us produce power from it. You know, look at Ontario. I think it's something like 60% reliant on nuclear, and that allows them to be pretty clean in their practices. So the whole rest of the country, if it adopted nuclear where it uses emissions intensive technology would be able to make that transition. Whereas if you go to the unreliable renewables, things like wind and solar, which definitely have their use cases, because I think they are a great part of the energy mix, but they're not the whole solution. So we have ways to solve these challenges, and I think if we start listening to consumers more, we will be able to drive government decision making. Often it's the other way around. Governments want to force consumers to do things. Consumers are reluctant often to do those things. They're not comfortable. They're not ready. They find it too expensive. Whatever it is, they resist. I think if you listen to what people want and then try to serve their needs, in most cases you can actually get to better outcomes.
Stewart, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Hey, thanks, Jim. Good talking to you again.
My guest has been Stewart Muir, Executive Director of the ResourceWorks Society. His website, resourceworks.com. If you have any questions for Stewart or any of our other guests, you can send them to info@howstreet.com. Find us on Twitter @HowStreet, our YouTube channel, Talk Digital Network. I'm Jim Goddard. Thank you for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.